that we do every Sunday at 4 p.m. Eastern. Just wrapped up watching a little bit of football, so that's why we have a late start. But for the next hour or so, I will be presenting on a subject that you guys got to vote on here on YouTube exclusively at the Friendly Neighborhood History channel, and you all voted about the British monarchy. And you all wanted to know, although a plurality of you wanted to know, there were other topics as well that will continue to be possible votes you can do. But you all wanted to know a little bit more about the modern British monarchy. And so I will be focusing on the development of the British monarchy, how it changed from autocratic rule to constitutional rule to ceremonial rule, starting in the 17th century all the way to the modern English family. And I've got King Charles III watching and fact-checking me from behind in his royal portrait. I think this is his royal portrait. But yes, there is. This is indeed King Charles III, and the story that I'm going to tell you really begins with the death of the last King Charles, Charles II, in 1685, and I will tread that entire course from 1685 all the way until the modern era, and I will be discussing what happened to the British family, how it became a ceremonial monarchy, the bumps and bruises that happened along the way, how they reacted to the growth of the British Empire, some of the highlights and lowlights of the British monarchy and the British Empire at this time, and how the monarchy was involved in that, and what the modern monarchy looks like today in the contemporary world, soon after the death of England's longest reigning monarch, Queen Elizabeth II. Now, just as a note before I get started, please like and subscribe and all of that great stuff. It's great to have you here at the Friendly Neighborhood History channel. I won't be interacting with the chat as much, but my wonderful moderators like Harry and Hars will probably do a great job of holding down the chat, posting those social medias, and referencing other material that I have available for you to watch whenever you'd like. And if you like history, you are in the right place. Consider liking and subscribing and becoming a friendly neighborhood historian. It's as easy as all of that. And join us as we detail the life and times of the British monarchy in the last 3 centuries. And maybe at the end there'll be time for Q&A. We will see how things are stacked up. But we had a really, really good Q&A yesterday that lasted over 2 hours, so that was really enjoyable. So thank you, everybody, for being there. Really appreciate it. Hopefully we see some of those new faces that we saw yesterday. But yes, basically, the British monarchy has changed significantly in the last few centuries, as most monarchies do. And the truth of the matter is the vast majority of monarchies that were extant in Europe in the 17th century are gone now. The French monarchy is gone. The Holy Roman Empire is gone. The Spanish monarchy is basically gone. Well, kind of. Italy had a monarch for a while and then got rid of it. Italy didn't exist in the 17th century as a united nation. But many of the monarchies in many of those areas of the world are either completely ceremonial, or forgotten, or gone completely. Of course, the Russian Empire is gone with its czar, who is tantamount to an autocratic monarch. And the British monarchy is no different in the sense that it is no longer an autocracy. It was an autocracy for an extremely long period of time. However, the British were the first, the English. And by the way, as a note, I will be using English and British interchangeably. England refers to the southeasternmost portion of the main island of Britain. Of course, England became the most dominant political power on the island, and of course swallowed up Wales and Scotland, the Isle of Man, the Isle of Wight, and Ireland, and now retains Northern Ireland as well as Scotland and Wales in what's called the United Kingdom, whereas Great Britain refers to the island itself, with Wales and Scotland along with England. However, the English, by the 17th century, 1600s, the English and the Scottish had a union of the crowns, so they weren't united as a political entity, so Great Britain didn't technically exist, but they were ruled over by the same person, and in this case, the monarch of the House of Stuart, King Charles II. So let me set the stage for you of how the British monarchy begins its vast changes, and you could make the argument that this really goes back all the way to 1215, when King John of Lackland was forced to sign the Magna Carta, which limited the power of the king and created this thing called the consent of the governed, or at least the consent of the nobility, which later became the basis for Parliament, the ability and the limits on the king's ultimate autocratic power, which developed throughout the centuries, where lords and nobles would continue to put checks on the king as Parliament became a more and more powerful political entity that the king needed to consult more and more often. However, the King Charles II's reign had been relatively successful. He had clashed with Parliament, much like his father, who had been killed in the English Civil War of 1642 to 1649. And afterwards, England had created a protectorate under a man named Oliver Cromwell, which was totally not a kingdom, even though Cromwell, when he died, passed his power to his son Richard in 1658. Richard proved to be pretty inept, and Parliament wasn't ready to run the country all by themselves, so they invited Charles, his son, also named Charles, who was living in France, to come back and become the king of England and Scotland again. And so that's how King Charles II came to the throne in 1660. If you've ever been to North Carolina or South Carolina, or you're from there, congratulations. That state is named after, those states are named after King Charles II, who colonized that area in the mid-1660s, as the English were starting to colonize the Atlantic seaboard. What happens next? Well, Charles Charles doesn't have any legitimate children. He has plenty of affairs and plenty of women, but he doesn't have any legitimate children to take over the throne when he dies in 1685. And so power passes to his brother, James II. Now, this is alarming to Parliament because England had been through a century and a half of turbulence since the start of the Protestant Reformation, in which they had become progressively more Protestant, despite the fact there were still strong Catholic traditions and elements in their society, culture, and government. This had been attacks on monarchs like Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, probably England's greatest monarch, and had spilled into the time of the Stuart dynasty, where more radical forms of Protestantism like Puritanism and Calvinism had become pretty predominant in major sections of England, combating with the more moderate Anglican Church, the established Church, and with the King's interests. Now, Charles II wasn't necessarily a Catholic. The rumor is that he became Catholic on his deathbed, but his brother James was a hardcore Catholic, and so for the first time in over 130 years, the English monarch was an open and devout Catholic, and this was worrisome to the Protestant Parliament, who made James promise that he would not bring England back to Catholicism. However, James's wife made a mistake. She had a child 3 years into his reign, or 2 years into his reign. I believe it's Charles is his name. He names him Charles after his brother, and Charles is baptized a Catholic. Now you have a Catholic line of succession that will probably bring England back into the folds of the Catholic Church a century and a half after Henry VIII took them away from it and created the Anglican Church, or the Church of England. So basically, the Parliament is furious at this. James, this, by the way, this is James's second wife. His first wife had 2 children, and one of them is named Mary, and one of them is named Anne, and both of them will become monarchs of England in their own right. Parliament asks Mary, the older daughter of James II, along with her husband, a man named William, the Prince of Orange, who they live in the Netherlands, which has been a very strong Protestant tradition, very strong. This is during the Dutch Golden Age of the 17th century, which I've lectured on before on this channel, and basically the 17th century was a time when the Dutch became one of the most prominent, wealthy, and powerful countries in Europe, despite the small size that they had. They had gotten free of the Spanish, the Habsburg yoke that had been upon them. So in 1648, the end of the 80 and 30 Years' War, respectively, the Dutch gained their independence from the Spanish Habsburgs, and so from there they had become one of the most predominant mercantile and commercial powers in all of Europe. Similar to how Portugal had been in the 16th century, the Dutch were like that in the 17th century, and Orange was one of the provinces, and William was the Prince of Orange. But Parliament invited Mary and William to overthrow James in a revolution. This was basically a coup d'etat performed by Parliament which should show that they did not hesitate, as they had 40 years previously, to overthrow a king that they believed was out of line. Of course, the out of line bottom line was that James II was a Catholic monarch who would return England to Catholicism, or at least let his son do it. An unbroken line of Catholic succession threatened to bring England back into the folds of a popery and bring it closer, perhaps, to its longtime enemies, such as France and Spain, which were predominantly Catholic at the time. In fact, this was during the time of Louis XIV, the Sun King, which was another option you guys could have voted on. It might be a live stream topic, should be a live stream lecture topic, and a long-form video topic in the future. But Louis XIV is obviously an extremely strong-willed Catholic monarch. He persecutes Protestants heavily, many of them fleeing, ironically, to North and South Carolina. They're called the Huguenots, or the Huguenots. You may have heard of them a little bit in American history. But James is basically faced with a mutiny, a coup d'etat performed by his parliament, which is just as bold as it was when they killed his father, Charles I, at the end of the English Civil War in 1649. 40 years later, James is facing a similar fate, but he can stand his ground and fight and create yet another English Civil War. James actually does something quite admirable. He decides to leave. Not feeling that he has enough support and not wanting to fight a long-time war against his daughter and son-in-law, he flees to France with his son. And his son and his grandson will continue to try revolutions throughout the 18th century to try to overthrow the next dynasty. Now, this is the House of Stuart. The next house will be called the House of Hanover, and we'll get to them in a little bit. Now, this is not modern necessarily. It's early modern still. It's only the 1600s. So why am I talking about this? Well, the truth of the matter is that this year, 1688, and the revolution where the bloodless revolution where King James II is overthrown, is a huge change in English political history and British political history and American history and Canadian history and everywhere that England has touched as an empire, especially in the Angloid spheres, areas like New Zealand, Australia, Canada, and the United States, because it changes the autocratic, or at least semi-autocratic monarchy, which had been bickering with Parliament for more than a century on the powers and the reaches of the king. Really, since the beginning of the 1600s, there had been this back and forth from James I to his son Charles I to his son Charles II, and now his brother James II, on how much power does Parliament have, how much say do they have in royal matters and in the succession line, and how much power does the monarch have relative to Parliament. And this proved that there was a huge amount of power in Parliament to be able to remove the king if they thought that he was not good enough. And so this showed that Parliament had gained the upper hand despite a century of monarchs pushing back on Parliament, from James to Charles to Charles to James again. It's kind of a chiastic structure there, parallelism. James flees to the continent, and Mary and William are invited to become monarchs. They become a king and queen. They rule jointly until 1694, when she dies, and he will stay on the throne until his own death in 1702. Now, William and Mary are able and capable monarchs. They take power without any blood. This is why the Revolution of 1688 is also called the Glorious Revolution, because although it's a heavy political revolution, it sheds no blood, it leads to no civil wars, and England remains prosperous and on its own 2 feet. Compare that to the French Revolution, which starts almost exactly a century later, and you can see a huge divide in the overthrow of the Bourbon monarchs in France, as opposed to the overthrow of James II Stuart in England and Scotland. By the way, remember, England and Scotland are not united into one country yet. England controls Wales. Wales has been long time part of England. Scotland is its own separate political entity, and the Scottish have a much more monarchical strain in them, so James and his son Bonnie Prince Charles will be very popular in Scotland. James's father, Charles, had been popular in Scotland. Most of the support for the monarchy had come from Scotland during the English Civil War, which had led to but that had not helped Charles defeat. This is really, if you want to call this a live stream lecture of anything, it's the live stream lectures of the Charles. We've already talked about Charles I, Charles II. We'll talk about Charles III at the end. What happens next? But there's a lot of monarchical support in Scotland. They're not as keen on Parliament as the English themselves are. They don't have as much of a parliamentary tradition as the English do. By the way, Parliament was invented in the 14th century, or really the late 13th century, by King Edward I, Longshanks, the guy from Braveheart, believe it or not, who famously would gather with his nobles, his lords, and a House of Lords, and convene about political matters, and they would meet together to parler, which is a French word meaning to speak. And you've probably seen Pirates of the Caribbean, so you know what parler means. But Parlement became the meeting, the organization of talking between the king and his House of Lords. Eventually, commoners and people who were not nobles were represented in those meetings, and that became the House of Commons, of commoners. So that is where you get the two houses, the bicameral nature of the British legislature, although the House of Commons is the predominant political power with the Prime Minister today. And this lecture is all about how that happened. So Parliament seizes a great amount of power for itself in 1688 with the Glorious Revolution. They make it very clear to William and Mary, you are in power because we chose to bring you over here and usurp your father. So Mary and William, you need to let us kind of call the shots, more or less. And this is this is where England gets an unofficial constitution, but also a Bill of Rights. The English Bill of Rights, I think of 1689, dictates certain individual rights for people, but also the rights of the government, and they start to restructure the entire basically this contingent agreement. You can become the monarch, but we're going to gain more power. Basically means that the king and queen's actions are more or less confined to approval from Parliament, so the king acts more like an executive, the monarch acts more like an executive than they had before, with Parliament actively being able to make legislation that changes political structures and civil issues. Now, there's still a cooperation between the monarch and the Parliament for political control. So it's not just that the monarch can just do whatever he wants, but it's also not like Parliament can just do whatever he wants. There's supposed to be a cooperative effort between the monarch and Parliament in order to get legislation passed. Parliament will pass laws and the king will enforce the laws. So it's kind of similar in some ways to the American system of government, at least originally envisioned by the founders, and that's no mistake because the founders grew up under the cloud of this political philosophy of constitutional monarchy, which becomes popular in Europe in the 19th century especially. Britain is still technically a constitutional monarchy to this day, although there is a difference between the constitutional monarchy of 1688 to 1833 and the ceremonial monarchy starting with William IV in 1833, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. So the king does have power. He can still, obviously, he has a lot of military power. He has the prestige, the wealth. He is the head of the state Church of England, but he is more limited than he has ever been, and realizes that he has gotten his governance from the consent of the governed. Now, these may sound like American revolutionary ideas, and they are taken heavily from the European strategies, from the British, the development of British constitutional monarchy in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. In 1707, a bankrupted Scottish colony called New Caledonia in Panama fails miserably. This leads the Scottish into heavy debts. The English Parliament agrees to absorb the debt of Scotland if Scotland will join politically with England. This leads to the unification of the entire island, and you now have Great Britain as an entity in 1707. So from now on, after that, it becomes the British. I will still use English occasionally interchangeably, but it is also going to include Scots and Welshmen. In 1702, William dies. Mary had died some years before that, and Mary's sister Anne takes over the throne, and her biggest accomplishment is, of course, getting the Act of Union in which they're brought together. Now, there's also something that Parliament has decided that it will do on behalf of the King and Queen from now on. The Parliament decides that it will create the Act of Succession. I believe it's 1694, something around there, where Mary dies. They come up with this Act of Succession and the basis for how a new monarch is, or maybe it's after William dies and when Anne is queen, but basically how a monarch is to be selected. It's usually the oldest child of the monarch in power at the time, or it is a sibling, but it can be a woman, it can be a man. They need to be Protestant. And it's only recently that Parliament revised that to allow, so there could be a Catholic monarch in England's future, technically speaking, now. But until very recently, in the last 10 years, basically from the end of the 1600s onward, the British monarch had to be a Protestant. Therefore, there could never be the return of the Stuart dynasty under James's descendants, whatever, because the monarch had to be a Protestant. Now, this creates an interesting conundrum. Anne had many different. They also have to be it doesn't matter the age necessarily. There's a regency if they're too young, but basically it's the closest living relation. Men get prominence. So if you have an older sister, the oldest male will still get the kingdom. But if there are no male direct descendants available, a woman could become queen. This is how it works, and this is what we'll see in 1952, by the way. But in 1837, with two of the most important British monarchs in all of their history, despite the fact that they are both figureheads. In 1714, Anne dies. She had several different children. None of them could live to maturity. Her closest relative is her cousin, James's son Charles, who could become the king. James II has died a long time ago, and Charles has spent most of his life trying to find a way to get back into the throne. But this new Act of Succession bans Catholics from... yes, that's true. 1701. Yes, that's when they got the Act of Succession. And yes, now it's no longer male prominence, but it used to be male prominence, and it used to be no Catholics allowed. Mary becomes, or Anne dies. Yes, that's true. Well, king and queen consorts can't be active monarchs either. That's not, so it doesn't really matter. By the way, a king or queen consort is, and I'm looking at the chat because Harry's giving me some extra information because he's a Brit, but basically, and an excellent historian, but basically a consort is the husband or wife of an active queen or king regent, the ruler of the kingdom, or the monarchy of the country. Excuse me. Excuse me. Anyways, live and right there. Anyways, what else was I going to mention? The next, Anne dies, so they go all the way to Germany, and this creates an unbroken line of connection between Germanic, the Germanic royal families in the various different German duchies and earldoms, and the British monarchy that exists to this day. So in order to find a Protestant male relative, they find George, the Duke of Hanover, who goes to England, and he becomes King George I in 1714. And this is where we get what's called, I call it the Georgian period, not just because of the architecture, but because all the kings in England for the next 100 years will be named George. George the First, Second, Third, and Fourth. Of course, George the Third is probably the most famous one, as he's the king during the American Revolution. He rules for 60 years. He goes mad near the end of his life and is placed in a regency where, for the first time ever, the active king cannot, well, not second time ever, since Henry VI. His son, George the Fourth, rules in his place, rather than the usual way it was done, where the younger son would have a regent if he was too young to take the throne. Happened with Edward III, for instance, in the 1320s. So you get George the First, George the Second, and Parliament starts to take more shape and form. There's a formation of the two major political parties in Britain at the time in the 18th century. This is also during the agricultural and beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. So Britain is changing tremendously. Its joint stock companies and mercantile exploits, its growing and burgeoning navy continue to assure that it will grow an international empire that is larger than anything we've ever seen in human history before. Regnant, yes, that's right. Regnant is the reigning monarch. Regent is someone who rules on behalf. Yes, I know that. So the regent, Regnant, is the ruling monarch. The regent is the one who takes the place of the monarch if the monarch cannot serve or is too young. So what happens? So there's a little bit of a pronunciation issue. Thank you, Harry. Anyways, so point being, what happens next? You have this succession of Georgian monarchs. Parliament takes form. You get the development of the Whig Party, which is a more people's party, and you have the Tories or the Conservatives, who are pro-monarchist. The Whigs tend to want to take more and more power away from the king. You see the development of the British political system. You see the development of the Prime Minister. I'm trying to remember who was. I think it's Greenville. Was it Greenville who was the first Prime Minister? This all happens in the 18th century during the Georgian period. William Pitt the Elder becomes one of the most important political actors in Britain during the 7 Years' War, which I consider to be World War I. Harsh, if you could put the link up where I explain exactly why the 7 Years' War, which Britain actively participated in, is the First World War, that would be very helpful. But as Foreign Secretary, William Pitt the Elder becomes extremely influential in political affairs, helping Britain win major contests against France, Russia, Austria, and the Native Americans, as well as the Native Indians, which allows Britain's expanse into India to push the French basically out and gain more and more power. The British East India Company is actually running India at the time. Robert Clive of India, was extremely successful in some of his campaigns, so Britain's ability to defeat the natives of different areas has already been established and will continue to be an issue that they exploit for over a century to come. What happens after this? Of course, so now let's use the American Revolution as a case study to see how the constitutional monarchy has developed. Yes, King George is involved very much so in suppressing the American Revolution and suppressing the actions of the American people. He is obviously in charge of royal colonies such as Massachusetts, which belong directly to the king in the American colonies. However, it is Parliament that is passing the laws such as the Townshend Acts or the Stamp Act that usually see this cycle of protest and boycotting, eventually with the British loosening or ending the new tax they had implemented on the Americans. The Americans believe they cannot be directly taxed by the British because they do not have representation in Parliament. The British believe that, basically tell them to shut up and accept the fact that they are being protected by the British Empire. They have been successful thanks to the British, so they should not be complaining at all. Of course, the Americans were an extremely important part of helping the British win what's the American phase of the 7 Years' War, or World War I, which is called the French Indian War, which helped the British take more and more land in Canada, as well as push the Native Americans into what's now the American Midwest and acquire that land around the Ohio River Valley in the north and Alabama, Mississippi in the south. So Robert Walpole, that's the first prime minister. Yes, the War of 1812 is not the First World War. That's incorrect. But anyways, what happens next? The American Revolution proves that the British Parliament has gained the upper hand in legislating matters, while the king acts as an executive, functioning in a militaristic capacity or an enforcement capacity when it is necessary for him. His great amount of land and wealth is extraordinarily conducive to his role in in being able to enforce the laws that Parliament passes. So he continues as sort of an executive overseeing all of this. And Steve asked a good question, which is directly related to this, which I'll answer. What do you know about the separation of state and religion in Britain, England, Great Britain, and the British Empire? The Anglican Church, there's a church in Scotland, there's a church in England, there's a church in Wales, there's a church in Ireland. By the way, Cromwell, during the 1650s, was able to conquer Ireland, something no British monarch had ever done before, English monarch had done before, and basically Ireland in the 1800s is governed as a separate entity, and then in the 1800s there's another act of union which adds Ireland, creates political union between Ireland, Scotland, England, and Wales until the 1920s when Southern Ireland is given its independence. So there isn't really a separation of church and state. The Anglican Church is the established Church of England. Several of the American colonies, for instance, had the Church of England established as the state church, which meant if you wanted to worship another church, you had to pay a tax. It's usually the Church of England, the Church of Wales, the Church of Scotland. I don't know if there's a Church of Wales, the Church of Scotland. Ireland struggles with this immensely because of a large Catholic population, which will continue to create rebellions in both the south and north, even after 1922, when Southern Ireland is given its independence. Let me see what happens next. I take a sip of coffee. That's what I do next because I need the energy to keep going. Hopefully everybody's having a wonderful Sunday and a great weekend. I'm having a great weekend. The Steelers won today, so I'm happy about that. Please like and subscribe if you haven't already. The British, this is the time of nationalism and industrial revolution. Oh, by the way, the British continue international success. This isn't really a lecture about the British Empire and its development, but just know that the British have already proven extremely successful overseas. They have the best navy in the world. They were able to defeat Napoleon. They're able to have, the industrial revolution really starts in Great Britain in the late 18th century and gets going before it will in France, Germany, or England. The United States. So the British are extraordinarily successful. So this parliamentary system seems to be working. The regency of George III will change more of a dialogue. As the Whigs gain more political power, more and more people see the monarchy as less and less potent and less necessary. At least in the sense of enacting legislation. The British Parliament basically is starting to make the argument, especially the Whigs, that we can enforce our own laws if necessary. We don't necessarily need the king to rubber stamp everything that we do, even though he won't necessarily do that. So it hopefully is the channel for you, Tyler. And hello, CD. I'm not interacting with the chat too much, but yes. And yes, they are all related. This is, by the way, the implementation of the House of Hanover from Germany to Great Britain in 1714 with the rise of George I, and his entire line being German, ties England to Germany. The English royal family and later the German royal family will be connected. The kings of Prussia will eventually become the German emperors, Kaiser Wilhelm I and Kaiser Wilhelm II of Great War infamy. The Russians are also connected. There's a lot of intermarrying going on amongst the family members of the royal family, and this will really kick into high gear in the 1840s and 50s under a new queen. But something important happens. A couple of important things happen. In 1833, the British become the first country in the world to abolish slavery. This is done under William IV, who is George. So George III dies of eventually. He's in his 80s. He's succeeded by his son George IV, who had already been his regent during his bouts of insanity. And George IV, known as kind of a lascivious wildflower. By the way, all of these kings hated their fathers and their sons. So George I hates George II, who hates his father. George III hated his grandfather, George II. George IV hated George III, and George III hated him. William IV is George IV's brother, and he comes to power in 1830 after George's death, and his daughter had died a couple years before that. So William IV is now the King of England. He is the brother of George IV, the son of George III. He rules for 7 years, and this is where I think it's 1833, 1834, 1835. The British abolish slavery, but they also enact. He basically enacts the. I've already talked about Queen Mary. He basically enacts Parliament enacts the law, and the king is kind of tied in his hands to enforce it. That basically gives Parliament main legislative power in Great Britain, and it stems the tide from a constitutional monarchy and puts Britain firmly in the camp of a ceremonial monarchy, which will mean there's a huge change. So for the last 190 years, just over, Britain has become more of a ceremonial monarchy. where the scandalous behavior of George IV, his relative incompetence and lack of popularity, wasn't able to be sated by William IV's relative competence. And so Parliament basically feels that at this point they should be the ones in complete control. And so for the last 190 years, the British monarchy is a ceremonial monarchy, which is different than a constitutional monarchy. In a constitutional monarchy, the monarch can still enact legislation, can still have his hand or her hand in legislation, and is meant to be the executive who enforces that legislation and can lead the army. There's even more power stripped away from the monarch, where basically Parliament will be the governing body that makes the laws, and the king or queen is supposed to can influence it. They can speak up. They can show their approval for the government. They can work with the government. They are still officially the head of state, but they are in a ceremonial capacity to kind of and they aren't even sought out for the rubber stamp anymore. It's kind of they're kind of sought out more just for cultural approval, whereas the monarch's voice is important because the monarch doesn't have the ability to enact laws, but he does have the ability to speak towards them, to speak towards the government, and to hopefully bolster the morale of the British people, to support the government during different events. The monarch opens Parliament. He does. Charles opened, and they opened the Parliament for all the Commonwealth countries, the former colonies. This is why Charles III opened Parliament in Canada with a very famous speech earlier this year. So that's how you see the development of a constitutional monarchy, aside from goes into a ceremonial monarchy where the king really doesn't have any power anymore. He's definitely seen as the head of state. He has a historical, financial tie to the British state. They are also in charge of the church, technically, but they do very little of the legislating on different matters of state, and Parliament is the one that takes the reins over from that. This will be extremely important, but the ceremonial monarchy isn't powerless. At least it's not unable to affect history. It's not just there to look pretty, because Britain's two most famous monarchs probably come from the ceremonial monarchical times. William dies in 1837 childless, and his younger brother's daughter, Victoria, comes to power. Now, everybody has probably heard of Queen Victoria, the Victorian age. But really, she has very little to do with it. She only through imagery, appearance, perhaps even a little bit of smoke and mirrors and manipulation, is this age dominated by a woman who has almost no political power. She is an extremely influential woman. She's perhaps the most famous woman of the 19th century, maybe the most famous female monarch in all history. And she is seen as this, at first, this young, beautiful, vivacious woman, and then later as this old grandmotherly-like figure that puts her stamp on the age, where the age is named after her. This age of traditional, proper Britishness, the spreading of British culture, the Pax Britannia, I think it's called, where Britain spreads its imperial wings and flies all over the world. The sun never sets on the British Empire. I think it was Shelley who said that. Or was the first to say that. This is the age of hyper-imperial colonization in Africa. Hyper-colonization, there, yeah, she was, but she wasn't, she didn't really, it didn't really work. But hyper-imperialization, hyper-colonization, where Britain will colonize major sections of Africa, will take direct control of India, continue to expand into New Zealand and Australia, and Guyana in South America, and the British Empire is on every single continent at this point during Victoria's reign. And this is the height of probably when you think of the British Empire, this is the height of the British Empire. The paternal social Darwinism that basically says the natives of these areas are unable and ill-equipped to take care of themselves. The growth of the Navy to unforeseen feats, the British Industrial Revolution causing economic, social changes that were unseen before in world history, the world of Charles Dickens, the world, not Jane Austen necessarily, the world of the Bronte sisters. This is all under the shadow of Victoria's rule, which is, I think, one of the greatest ironies in history, because Victoria is not that powerful of monarch. She did have a lot of influence, but she didn't have any direct influence. And what makes her the best monarch is her appearance and how she appears to the state, what she does to influence decisions from behind the scenes, not that she conquers lands, not that she leads troops into battle, not that she does not that she does much directly to affect Britain's scale and influence, but that she does a lot politically and culturally to be a relevant figure. What makes Victoria more powerful than perhaps any other monarch in the figurehead era is her imagery. It's the decorum, it's the properness, it's the style, it's the age named after her that makes her so important to the British people. So Britain could technically function, pass laws, and get things done through legislative means without Victoria being in the picture. But the empire never would have gotten far without Victoria because she's a symbol of morale. She's a symbol of British elegance. She's a symbol of the need for imperialism. You want to make your empress happy. You want the empire to thrive and be successful. Victoria, by the way, leads one of the most unhappy lives imaginable. She marries the love of her life, Albert. She's constantly disappointed in her son, Edward. Albert dies after a fight with Edward because Edward is kind of a playboy. And once again, you have the monarch hating their offspring. Albert's death devastates Victoria. They had 9 children together. They were very much in love. They would oftentimes stay up all night just staring at each other in bed after other things happened, and they were a very extremely happy couple, and she was never the same after he dies. And you get this young, beautiful, vivacious woman who kind of comes out, and you get the portly grandmother like figure we see of Victoria in the but she actually goes into a depression, and she's out of the public eye for many years. And the empire continues to function. The economy is doing great. Britain, this is the golden age of the British Navy. Everything seems to be working well. Britain is starting to colonize Africa at this time. And so there's really a lot of people start to raise the eye about why should there even be a monarch? What's the use of this monarch if she's just going to be depressed and pouty and not be around? Yes, he did. Yes, that sounds like something Albert would do. Albert was a workaholic who basically worked himself to death in many ways. And I don't care about the Trent affair. But regardless of that, Victoria proved to be more formidable coming out of her depression than she had been before her depression, even when Albert was alive. If you've ever experienced a horrible loss and you need to move forward and you need to find a way to live again, look at what Queen Victoria does starting in the 1870s, late 1860s. At the behest of Benjamin, so there's a man who realizes that this won't work. None of this will work unless Victoria's in the picture. That the monarchy is so integral to British society, especially English society, that if you get rid of the monarchy, then you get rid of the ancient historical tradition that basically gives implicit support for what you want politically, and you lose the people. The people will not stand for this. I've got to move because I'm at low power. But basically, Victoria comes to the mindset, or the British Parliament, under the leadership of probably one of its finest political minds, Benjamin Disraeli, comes to the conclusion that basically the British monarchy does not survive. Britain as an empire does not survive and thrive without a monarch like Victoria. You need a monarch like Victoria. You need a monarch who's going to be a cultural symbol and icon so that you can continue to succeed and thrive and grow. And so the monarchy is integral to being British, and the British are the greatest people in the world by this logic. So therefore, you need the monarchy to continue, or you won't have anything. And this is Charles III. You should know that because you have a British flag. So she reemerges, and she is crowned. There is a jewel taken from India called the Star of India, which is placed in her crown, and she becomes the Empress of India. So she is restyled as this grandmotherly-like figure, this matriarchal figure. The most powerful woman in the world is this old, overweight grandmother, who is just the most genteel and proper woman, and all proper British people and women especially, should seek to emulate the royal family and seek to emulate Queen Victoria. But the irony is that Victoria doesn't have that much power. This is a smokescreen, but it shows the power of ceremonial monarchy, whereas an autocratic monarch could do mostly what he wanted, and a ceremonial monarch was a kind of a joint working with Parliament, constitutional. The ceremonial monarch is a figurehead. They don't have any real political power, but they have image, and image is what sells. And this is the time of photography, the Industrial Revolution. You have more access than you ever had before. You eventually have moving pictures, which comes about near the end of her life. So there's obviously a way to capture this queen, to show her beauty, to show her importance to the British people. Yes. What was I going to say next? Victoria rules 64 years. At the time, it's the longest reigning monarchical period in English history, in Scottish history, in British history. So, and by the time she dies, Britain is at the top of its game. It controls large sections of Africa, including Egypt and South Africa. Of course, it already has India and Pakistan. It controls Australia, Canada, although it is starting to give self rule, and there are signs of decolonization and there are decolonization efforts going around. But the British Empire is at its height, and probably is its most famous moment under Queen Victoria, where the Union Jack flies all over the world, and the sun never sets because it can be morning in Africa and evening in Canada. But there are British provinces available where it is morning somewhere, or daytime somewhere, so the sun never sets on the British Empire, even when the sun went down in London town. So Victoria dies and leaves the throne to her relatively unlikable, or at least she disliked him, son, Edward VII. Now, here's the fascinating thing. Victoria was German, of course, from the House of Hanover, but she had married Albert, prince from the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, mainly because there was a view amongst the royals that if you intermarry, and this had gone back for over a millennium in European history, that people of royal families, even with no political power and ceremonial positions, were better, had some sort of superior breeding, were obviously more intelligent and educated, and so blue blood was better. And so the class of society that the British are very well known for was in full sway for the entire empire. So the yeah. Yes. Yeah, which saying that's funny, Harry, because that was Bismarck she was referring to. So the marriage to Albert connects the royal family with a bunch of German royal family members, and eventually with the Prussians themselves. This creates a kinship between Victoria's descendants and Kaiser Wilhelm I and his son, Kaiser Wilhelm II, and also with Alexander III, the Tsar of Russia, Alexander II, and Nicholas II. By the way, Alexander II, one of the greatest czars in Russian history, dated Victoria and was quite interested in marrying her before he became czar. And before she became the Queen of England, but they eventually didn't work out. It would have been very fascinating to see Alexander II, one of the most liberal-minded czars in Russian history, wedded to one of the most important women in history, Queen Victoria. But Victoria's legacy spread onward not just from the power of the British Empire and Bombay Sapphire Gin, but also through her family ties that were now firmly entrenched within the German royal family, the Prussian royal family, and you have Albert's connection there. So and they have 9 children, and many of them marry into German families. So now you have connections to the Grecian royal family, you have connections to the German royal family, the Russians, all of them. And so by the time you get to 1914, Nicholas II of Russia, George V of England, and Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany not only are all related, they all look like each other, visit with one another frequently, and take pictures together that are some of the most uncanny things you've ever seen in world history. Why? Because of what happens between 1914 and 1918 when these 3 men, who are at least 2 of which are very powerful, Kaiser Wilhelm and Nicholas II, plunge their countries into warfare with each other that kills millions of people. And although George V is not in charge of the government, he is certainly a extremely important ceremonial monarch, representing an image of due diligence and duty, and also of military prowess and virility to his people during the Great War. So what happens next? Well, Edward VII is kind of progressive. He champions, I believe he champions suffrage for women, which is a huge thing in Britain at the time. He has a more open view to the suffering of the natives in the different British colonies. And he's not as chauvinistic about the British Empire as his mother was. But his reputation as a playboy has kind of preceded him. He's seen as kind of the anti-Victoria, anti-Albert, and so he's not very likable. History has not been kind to Edward VII. And he actually establishes a new house because he's not, from his patrilineal basis, which becomes known as the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, which is named after his father's princely title. So the House of Hanover actually ends, and the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha takes over in 1910. This royal house will last for 13 years. In 1910, in 1901, I'm sorry, last for 13 years, 1901 to 1914. In 1910, Edward dies and is succeeded by his son George. Again, another monarch who didn't really care much for his father, something you're going to be, and the father who didn't care much for his son. George V is a sailor. He's interested in naval warfare, and that becomes a huge propaganda piece during the Great War, where they present him as this regal figure. But once again, it's all about image. It's all about presentation. And in the middle of a war, you need your monarch, especially a world war, you need your monarch to present to people an image of calm serenity, which is what you see in many of George V's portraits and pictures, but also of proper royal duty. The monarch himself is involved in the home front of the war and is doing everything he can to help us win this war, even though he has no political power and will never lead troops into battle and never lead a ship into a naval conflict. So George V rules for 26 years. He oversees Great Britain at its absolute peak, by the way. He's the Emperor of India, which is the title for the British monarch by this point. Britain gains its most amount of colonies by annexing Somalia, I believe Somalia, Yemen, after the end of the Great War, and taking over territories in the Middle East and mandating them, basically controlling them until they think it is best for them to decolonize. However, starting in 1922, the empire does start to decolonize with Southern Ireland, and this is a process that continues to last in many ways, but will last for 75 years, which Britain will slowly but surely lose all of its colonies in Africa, decolonize in India, let Canada go free, Australia, New Zealand, and eventually it will culminate with Hong Kong being decolonized in 1997, one of the most controversial decisions in Harry's mind. But George V dies in 1936. He's taken over by his son Edward VIII, who takes all of the prestige and glamour of Victoria and all of the regal dutifulness of his father, and smashes it and does the opposite by being one of the most cantankerous English monarchs. Once again, not heavily politically influential, although he was sympathetic to the Nazi regime in Germany. He's far more known as a playboy, much like his grandfather, Edward VII. But his playboy antics almost destroy the prestige of the monarchy. Just showing you, a reputation takes a century to build, from Victoria to the time of Edward VIII. There's about 100 years, and could take only 10 months to destroy. Edward has had many affairs, but he has an affair with an American divorcee, which is tantamount to, at that time, religious heresy in the Church of England. It becomes a huge major scandal. It's condemned by Parliament. It's extremely unpopular, and Edward is never really given permission from the government to be able to marry her. It's a huge slam in the face. It's a huge insult to the prestige of the British monarchy, and basically the British monarch's reputation and legacy is at an all-time low when Edward VI leaves in December of 1936. The popularity and the usefulness of the monarchy is once again in question, which is a huge if you look at modern British monarchy, ever since the creation of a ceremonial monarchy in the 1830s, a huge question has been, does the British monarchy even need to continue? Victoria had resoundingly proven that it needed to because of what it did for the morale, prestige, and cultural standing of the British people. And George V had done it through the war, and Edward VII had done it basically by doing nothing because Britain was so powerful at the time. And now Edward VIII had not done it by basically humiliating the monarchy, and humiliations for the monarchy will continue for the rest of the story. But then in 1936, in December, he's succeeded by his brother George, who never really wanted to be the king, has a stammer, and is not very well known. He's in poor health for most of his reign, and yet he is soon thrown into the thicket of the largest war in human history, World War II, what I consider to be World War III, and this becomes a huge, huge issue. He eventually learns how to tackle his stammer and gives addresses to the British people to boost their morale and encourage them during the war. This becomes the basis for the movie The King's Speech. He befriends Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister, who becomes a political tutor to his daughter, Elizabeth, which will be important later. And Churchill, as braggadocious as a figure as he is, I have 2 live stream lectures on Churchill and a long form video. So Harris, put in the video on Churchill in the chat. That's one of my favorite videos that I made. So please go watch that when you can. George is basically told by Churchill, look, we all know how this works, but you need to present a united front, you need to present strength, and you need to show that the British people that you are in it to win it, and you are not going to flee to the country because you're worried about German bombs. During the bombing of Britain, the Battle of Britain in 1940, where the Nazi Luftwaffe was devastating the British skyline, George and his wife, the Queen Mother, also named Elizabeth, who is of Scottish ancestry, stay in Buckingham Palace, refusing to leave despite bombs falling all over the place, even into the palace itself. Yes. By the way, the House of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, they changed the name in 1914. It doesn't become any less German, but they changed the name because of their war with the Germans. They changed it to the House of Windsor, Windsor Castle, where I believe George V resided at. And it's because they don't want to be associated with their German past. So basically, because they're fighting the Germans. So basically, the House of Hanover and the House of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, although a very German royal family, adopts the House of Windsor, and that has been the name for over a century since then. What happens next? Well, Britain wins the war. You know that very well. And the decolonization period begins soon afterwards. And so does the Cold War. Churchill leaves power. Clement Attlee is brought in. And George continues kind of in the shadows quietly. He's seen as a hero by his people. He has restored the dignity of the monarchy, and it is more popular than ever before. That our king would suffer with us is a huge, huge boost to British morale in the darkest days of the war before they had the United States to bail them out. So yes, that's true, and that's a historian's perspective, and it's actually true. So in 1952, George dies, and his daughter Elizabeth takes the throne, and now you have Elizabeth II, who is probably one you're all very familiar with. She'll rule for 70 years, and her reign is kind of a combination of the dignity of the monarchy preserved by her father, her grandfather, George V, and, of course, her great-great-grandmother, Victoria. She's kind of following in that pattern in her own personal life. She has this very, very close love. She's very comparable to Victoria in her personal life. She has very, very long-time romance with her husband, Philip of Greece, who is her cousin, yes, because they were tied to the Greek royal family. She marries her cousin, Philip. And they have a very, very deep connection, a very, very deep love. At last, he lives to be almost 100. He dies a year before she does. She rules for over 70 years. She's the longest reigning British monarch. So there's a lot of dignity, a lot of grace. She kind of embraces the idea of losing her empire and lets the empire go quietly into that still night, go gently into that quiet night. And so she doesn't rage against the dying of a light when it comes to the empire. She embraces the plights of the different colonized peoples. She comes out against apartheid, which is huge because South Africa was once controlled by the British. She drives in a car with Nelson Mandela. She sees all of her empire kind of fall away, and she deals with it with a lot of grace and sanctimony, and she's very respected for that. However, this is probably her biggest problem. Her son Charles wanted to marry Camilla. Is it Parker Bowles? I don't remember. I don't really care. He wants to marry a woman named Camilla. They don't approve. They basically kind of arrange a marriage with a woman named, as you probably have heard of her, Princess Diana, who becomes one of the most, again, kind of embraces that whole image of, despite a very, very turbulent private life, Princess Diana, once again, the image, the smoke and the mirrors is huge, embraces this dignity of the British monarchy. But it's a kind of a fascinating thing. She becomes a humanitarian. She goes around the world working with UNICEF. She's a glamorous and beautiful woman, and Charles is kind of seen as this homely, ugly man. Their marriage is clearly, from the early parts of it, not a happy one. They have 2 sons, maybe. They have at least one son, William, who is now the heir to the throne, the Prince of Wales. And they also have Harry, and the less I talk about Harry and Meghan Markle, the better off I'll be mentally. But basically, the marriage is not an extremely happy one. It is not an enjoy. It is, and it becomes the big tabloid headlines because now you've got television, and now you've got the paparazzi. You have all of these things that you didn't have before, and Princess Diana does something quite fascinating that hasn't happened before, because of the television exposure, because of her beauty, because of her grace and her charm. She steals the limelight away from Charles. She's divorced from Charles, and many people see this as a stain on the royal family. Many people eventually, even in Great Britain, side with her over the royal family, which basically the implicit notion is that Philip and Elizabeth put pressure on Charles to divorce her. And a lot of people feel to this day that Charles is responsible not only for the divorce, but also for for her death. Their marriage, again, is not a happy one. And Charles is not allowed to remarry for another, I think, 20 years. But Diana has stolen the hearts of the British people. So the prestige of the monarchy suffers, which is huge, again, for British political theater, especially for the Tories or the Conservatives. And this all happens, by the way, during, I think it's almost around the time of Margaret Thatcher, who's probably the most impactful female British political figure who is not a monarch and is obviously one of the most famous British prime ministers, who's also very influential and has an interesting relationship with the Queen, to say the least. Thatcher's very insistent on her way about things. But if I'm correct, they had some civility. Not a lot, but some. The Queen denounces Thatcher's refusal to condemn apartheid when the Queen herself condemns apartheid in South Africa in the 1980s. Again, extremely important to the British because South Africa was once one of their colonies. So where does that leave us? Well, we're almost at the end of a lecture, but I think I can wrap it up from here. Diana dies. The Queen doesn't make a public statement or appearance. I'm trying to remember if they went to the funeral. I think they didn't go to the funeral, and that really, or maybe they did. Maybe she and Philip did. Someone should remind me if they went to the funeral. But basically, the distance, the coldness, the conspiracy theories surrounding Diana's death all really hurt the... Margaret actually got a good telling off when she refused. Yes, that's true. She did go to the funeral. She didn't appear in public for several weeks after Diana died, and that really hurt the prestige of the monarchy. And the prestige of the monarchy is quintessential to the funeral of Princess Diana. The prestige of the monarchy is quintessential to the survival of the ceremonial monarchy since Victoria lost Albert. Elizabeth rules for a very long time. It seems like she's never going to die. Many people believe she wants William to be king, so she wants Charles to die first. But in 2022, she does die after just 70 years on the throne, following her jubilee. A year after her beloved husband Philip dies, and then we see the rise of Charles III, who has been the king for the last 3 years, has spoken out in favor of social justice, climate change, and different issues there. Basically, the prestige of the monarchy is now kind of turbulent. A lot of people don't like Charles. They like the Queen. They don't necessarily admire him. The issues of Princess Diana continue to haunt his legacy and have stained what a lot of people have considered actually a pretty proactive monarchy in the sense of speaking up about issues and things like that. Let me see. I'm trying to remember one more. There's one more thing. Oh, yes. And of course, somebody mentioned in the chat, you can't mention it. One of Elizabeth, we can't go this entire thing without one more thing. Elizabeth has problems with Charles, but there's also Prince Andrew. Prince Andrew is married to Sarah Ferguson. They have a raucous marriage and a terrible divorce. And once again, you see this parent being prestigious, this child being seemingly debauched, if you will. But now you have two issues of that. You have Sarah Ferguson, Fergie, and her problems with Prince Andrew, and then you have King Charles. And what became an issue some years ago, and at the end of Elizabeth's life, and has spilled into Charles's reign, is Andrew's connections with Jeffrey Epstein, and his obviously all of the issues that go into that. So at the end of the day, this is where the British monarchy is in its modern section. The ceremonial monarchy must be preserved. This is the effort of Parliament to preserve it properly, because it means a lot for the political safety of the government, of whatever prime minister is there. Usually, the Conservatives are more interested in this than the Liberals, which have gone away, and now it's the Labour Party. And the Whigs, by the way, were the Liberal Party. yeah. So, um, yeah, the Prince Andrew, Prince Charles, now King Charles. There's been a lot of slams to the prestige, and we'll see if that pattern of somebody coming in to kind of rescue the day continues. Could it be William and Kate Middleton, who are very popular? It could be. But right now, the British monarchy is kind of once again in this cycle, in the ceremonial monarchical era of prestige, disgrace, prestige, disgrace. So, and yes, he does supposedly have quite horrible tantrums. A lot of Americans do not like Charles, and a lot of Brits do not like Charles. So, will there be someone to come to save the day and restore the prestige of the British monarchy? We'll see. But there you go. And history is a contemporary thing. History lasts into the present day. So I've given you a history from the early modern to the contemporary world of what happened and what transpired with the British monarchy from the end of the autocratic rule, the rise of the constitutional monarchy, the replacement of that with the ceremonial monarchy, and of course the description of the modern royals all the way to the present day. If you want more information on this, you can watch my long-form video, which will drop today, which is a compilation of a series I've done. I have an entire short series of videos on English monarchs all the way from the Norman Conquest to this, and a compilation long-form videos of different eras of that, including the modern one, which will come out later today. So please go check that out, both long and short form content. We're at an hour. I'll take about 10 minutes if anyone has any questions. Hopefully you enjoyed this. If you did, please like and subscribe. If you really enjoyed it, consider giving a super chat or becoming a member for early access and bonus content. But really appreciate that. No pressure whatsoever. And yes, indeed, we are dealing with a German royal family like John is mentioning. Always keep that in mind. Questions. Thank you, AJ London, for subscribing. I really appreciate that. Questions about history. So Andrew has been kicked out of the monarchy. Yes, he's been stripped, I think, of his royal titles. Do you remember the stories for when you made me and Harry moderators? No. I think it was the channel we were having really small live streams, and you guys offered to help. So yeah. You love the King from Scotland. Glad to hear. God save the King and Queen. Questions about history. Let me see. I'm just looking at the. I heard George of the Jungle also had quite the. Of course. Yeah. King Charles, in a move to save the face of the monarchy, has stripped his brother of his titles and protections. Yeah. Friendly, please tell Harry to stop eating beans on toast. It's hurting his image. I don't really care what the British eat. I'm glad to have people from like Harry from the UK and. Who was it who mentioned they were from Scotland? Mark is from Scotland. Or not Mark. AJ London is from England, obviously. Monk is from Scotland. So, I remember you needed a moderator one day, and I was interested in history a lot, and you agreed, and then you made Harry a moderator because you wanted to be fair. Yes, sounds about right. How's the American press dealt with Harry and Meghan? Okay, maybe the last part of it is the Harry and Meghan, which is another issue of distress for the monarchy. But Harry was known as kind of a playboy, very contrary to his brother William. Once again, you have the playboy brother and the dutiful son of George VI and Edward VIII. But basically, Harry eventually settled down and married American model and actress Meghan Markle. Markle is I'm trying to remember her ethnicity. I'm going to butcher it. She is African American, at least partially African American, and so there was concerns of her being not welcomed properly into an all-white family, the British monarchy, which is historically very classist. Of course, the British monarchy has had many, many issues with racism and segregation in its past. So her familiarity and fitting into the royal family was an issue. There was obviously tension and trouble, and eventually they kind of left the royal public life and kind of retreated to more private life. They gave a very infamous interview with Oprah where a bunch of rich people basically complained about how life was hard, which I think is one of the stupidest things they could have ever done. This hurt their prestige. There was obviously a disconnect between him and his grandmother. There was accusations of racism within the royal family by asking how dark the child Harry and Meghan had would be. I'm trying to... They had kids? I'm trying to remember. And thank you. Amazing. I really appreciate that. And, of course, Charles is probably the one who's really at fault because Charles is an idiot. But, yeah, they still take a lot of the British money. So there's a little bit on the Harry and Meghan stuff. How much money does the government spend on their monarchy? I don't know. If the Romans hadn't invaded Britain, would they have ever had an empire themselves? That's a good question. So much of British identity is tied to the fact it brings them towards Europe. Britain has had this incredible political and historical narrative that they can be British one day and on their own and European the next day. And so that connection between Europe and England really starts with Julius Caesar and later Claudius Caesar, who conquers it. And that obviously ties them to Gaul and Spain and creates a Latin tradition, and that's why English is a partially Latin language. England is always deciding whether it wants to be European or not. And and if you don't think that is over, Brexit is a great example of England deciding how European it wants to be. Do you think William will, when crowned, give Harry the same treatment that Charles has now given Andrew? No, Andrew is totally perverted. I don't think Harry is totally perverted. I don't think that he could do that. William seems more beneficent than Charles, who seems pretty vindictive. I don't know. I don't care. The Americans had a revolution to get rid of this crap. Why do we care about European? Well, that's exactly what I was saying. 1707 was the Act of Union, yep. 1801 was the Act of Union, yep. So let's see. Talk about the history of the penny in America. Copper is obviously a huge part of that. They're not making the penny anymore because it actually costs more money now. That's always been the issue. Obviously, back in the day, when sans inflation, the penny was able to carry some value, but now it carries almost nothing. So, let me see here. Other questions about history or social studies? We got about 5 more minutes. We just finished our live stream lecture on the modern British monarchy, culminating with King Charles III. And Mark here from Scotland. Great. It's great to have you here. Great Britain is 1707. The United Kingdom, which includes Ireland, is 1801. So let me see here. Who was greater, Elizabeth or Victoria? I think the Diana thing has hurt Elizabeth enough, and the Harry and Meghan thing hurt her enough, and King Charles III has hurt her enough. So we started this lecture with Charles II, by the way, and we ended with Charles III. So it was really it's a Carolingian lecture, but I'd say Victoria, just because Britain was so much more powerful when she was in charge. Could the next live stream lecture be about James Madison? That'd be a good one. He's my favorite founding father. So, let me see here. You need to send $50 billion to Israel right now. No, I don't. Who's your favorite British royal? Currently alive? Probably William and Kate. This very interesting stuff, FYI, to help your talking cadence is too fast and is hurting you. More people will stay and watch with more relaxed info. Yeah, that's fine. Whatever. I needed to go an entire hour to get all of this in. So I did that. I'm sorry. I'm trying not to talk too fast, but I did that. Let me see. James Madison's presidency, War of 1812. I will not discuss the War of 1812 if I do a lecture on James Madison. I've done a live stream lecture about the War of 1812. I'm sick and tired of talking about the War of 1812. Who was cooler, Hardrada, William, or Godwinson? William, obviously, was cool enough to win. It's crazy that Harold II ends the Viking Age by defeating Harold Hardrada. This huge victory. I think it's Stamford Bridge, and then just turns around and loses his life at Hastings. I'll see if Friendly History knows it. Before the pound was decimalized in 1971, how many pennies were in a pound? I'm not sure. I'm not. I want to say 25. How do you define long-term benefits and short-term benefits of winning a war? I'm not doing this with you right now. What do you think about Klaus Schwab's view on stakeholder capitalism? I'm not going to get into the economics of what Klaus Schwab thinks. The less I think about him, the better. What is the most technologically advanced civilization? Right now, the United States and China are pretty neck and neck. 240 pennies. Thank you for telling me that. As an American, I don't give about UK, Europe. A lot of people don't, but you should, because without any of the things I just described, there would be no United States. 20 shillings to a pound. So 12 times 20 is 240. There you go. So pence. So 12 pence would be a 1 shilling. And then a pound was a pound of silver. The stream has been it's been a live stream lecture about the British monarchs, but now I'm just in a Q&A at the very end, Vivian. Future is Chinese, or rest in peace, United States. Could be. Hello, Salinger. Great to have you here. I'm not doing this with you. You think you have so much aura. I do. I have a lot of aura. And I have enough aura to say that I've already discussed this long-term, short-term benefit nonsense with you, and it doesn't change anything about the War of 1812. However, you could not bring in 240 pennies and turn them into a pound because it was only convertible to a shilling, and then a shilling was convertible to a pound, which makes sense. Yeah, just too many pennies there. So 240 pence is not something you're just going to walk around with. 1 pound of silver equals cut, yeah. Why does the king have fat hands? I don't know. I don't know much about his health. Do you have any ancestry dating back to British monarchs? I'm not British, so I have no connection to this other than my absolute love of history and my willingness to share that knowledge with all of you. Let me see here. Anything else? Let's see. We're about 70 minutes in. I promised 10 minutes of Q&A, so we've got about 1 more minute. If anyone has any questions, please like and subscribe on your way out if you are, when we wrap up in a minute. But thank you, everyone, for coming. Who is considered the GOAT monarch? In British history, it's probably Victoria. Elizabeth I is probably, because she's more of an active ruler, would probably be the GOAT monarch. For me, it's Elizabeth I or Edward I, Longshanks. The bad guy from Braveheart was actually an extremely good monarch. It's crazy how good he was. Yes. Just because some small events took place doesn't ignore the fact the large impact. Yeah, small events like, being humiliated in Canada and having your capital burned to the ground, your president has to flee, you have to sue for peace. Yeah, small events. The benefits that you mentioned as short and long-term benefits of the War of 1812 aren't because of the War of 1812. It's because the British refused to slap the wrist of the Americans. Harry, will you deal with Harse on this? For once, I actually agree with you about the British winning this war. It's obvious they won this war. They not only won this war, they double-fisted winning this war with beating the frickin' Napoleon. So I don't even know how you can try to deride it by, the Americans weren't crushed and they weren't turned back into colonies. That's abject nonsense. I hate the theory that the Americans lost the War of 1812 and the British wanted to win that war so that they could make them colonies again. Outrageously stupid idea. No historical precedent for it whatsoever. My family is from Sweden. Well, thank you, Robin, for joining us. Can you do a Mongolian Empire talk next? That'd be fun. I've done talks on the Mongols before, but that should be a topic. I could revisit it, the different Khanates. Who do you think killed her? Not sure. Could have been an accident, just like we saw. You are ignoring the largest impact for the UK and the US, or just sucking up to the British like the Tory you are to impress Harry. I'm not a Tory. I would not be a Tory if I was British. I'd probably be a liberal, just because I would want to be controversial. And it's a historical party, and nobody is it anymore. I'm just not impressed with... I'm not impressed... I don't want to talk politics too much, but I'm not impressed with the Conservative Party in Great Britain, nor am I impressed with the Labour necessarily. And the Reform is just AFD light, so... yes, the impact is not... Infects and impact do not change how wars are won. Was George III really bloodthirsty, as the revolutionaries say? No. Most of the propaganda about him, which was... by the way, the political cartoons of that era was what made us think Napoleon was short, because the British manipulated the media. Farmer George, as he was known, was a pretty humble and self-effacing man, who wielded power very gingerly during his 60 years. Really, his 52-year reign. Last 8 years were done in a regency because he was mentally incompetent. But it depends on whose side you take. But the Americans did make him look a lot worse than he was. Did America not lose the War of 1812? The rule was that Americans could never be a king, so no official monarchy was the outcome, and then they burned Canada, and then Canada burned down the White House. Mega Man, burning down a capital may sate you for a loss of war. It certainly sates me for you losing a war, but it doesn't sate some of the moderators here. What if magic was real and fantasy was real and you had superpowers? What would you do? Well, I would become an elf wizard, so there you go. And then I would roll a d12 to find out my dexterity. Would you ever want or d20, whatever it is. Would you ever want to own slaves? No. But that's because I live in a context where slavery is abhorrent. Just because you think... This is a great question, by the way. I know you're asking it to troll, but everybody always says, I would hide Jews during the Holocaust, and I would be against slavery and the American Civil War. You don't know that. Context and social upbringing is so big on who we are as people that it's very easy to moralize now. Don't moralize. Don't wag your finger at the people of the past. Some of them deserve to have a finger wagged at them because they obviously did evil, knowing full well it was evil. But a lot of people are more ignorant and gray morally than you think. So that's a good place to end at. Don't judge the past. Yes, I'm owned by Israel. Hilarious. I'm from the United States. Tell it no chaser, bro. Okay, then. Yes. Well, please like and subscribe on your way out. Thank you so much for joining us. You got an extra 3 minutes out of me because you guys had such great questions, and we'll be having a live stream lecture every Sunday, so you can vote on next week's topic as well. And just appreciate everybody for coming. And we will see you again Friday, 6 p.m. Eastern, hopefully, for our Q&A. You can ask me anything about history or social studies. We will be doing a special live stream lecture. I've done it before, but I'm going to do it again about the history of Thanksgiving on Wednesday, November 26th at 6 p.m. So please join us there. We will be doing some fun stuff around Thanksgiving that I hope you all will really enjoy. My mods are not dumb. They're good people. But Colonizer should not have gotten banned. It's good to see you, Colonizer. And why was he hidden? Stop doing that. Stop. Okay. All right. See you guys. Take care. Have a great week. We'll see you Friday at 6 p.m. Eastern for Q&A 1, Saturday 6 p.m. Eastern for Q&A 2, and then you can vote here on YouTube, exclusively on YouTube, for our live stream lectures topic for next Sunday at 4 p.m. Eastern. And please, please, please watch all of the short form and long form content. You've got the long form video about this story, the British monarchs in the modern era, coming out later today. Really appreciate everybody. Like and subscribe on your way out. Take care. Have a great week. And as always, love history. Bye-bye now, guys.